have we, as an English-speaking society, finally accepted y'all for the word that it definitely is, or is there still some trouble with that?
I think it possibly depends on which country you're speaking for. It's not generally used in British English.
I would say it is used pretty thoroughly here.
Right, as a contraction for you all.
Yes, but I think it's good that we have it because, like, lots of other languages have a plural you.
Yes.
And English does not, and we need one.
Yeah. No, I'll go with that. I would say the only important thing is where the apostrophe goes.
Yeah.
That's true.
I would argue that I have a preference, and it's for yous. And if you put an apostrophe in it, it could be you guys.
Right.
Sure, yeah. But really, the most proper is use guys.
Use guys, yeah. Put them all together.
Welcome to Butter No Parsnips. Every week on Butter No Parsnips, your hosts Kyle Imperatore and Emily Moyers take you on an adventure through the weird, wacky, wonderful, and sometimes even wicked world of one wayside word. Strange characters, delightful bits, and general joyousness abound. Join them as they test each other's etymological expertise.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Butter No Parsnips. I'm Kyle Imperatore.
And I'm Emily Moyers.
And today, we have something incredibly important to talk about with you, the audience.
That's right, Kyle. There's a war going on.
And we don't mean the one that you're thinking.
Or the other one that you're thinking.
Or probably any of the ones that you're thinking.
Today, we're taking a step away from format to address none other than apostrophes.
That's right, apostrophes, contractions, possessions, Irishmen, and more still, the apostrophe is seeing its very existence threatened by an inattentive, unbothered general public.
But there's hope yet, good people of the word world, a final line of defense for what remains of a civil society.
Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to our secret weapon.
Hi, I'm Bob McCalden, and I'm chairman of the Apostrophe Protection Society.
That's right, everybody! The Apostrophe Protection Society! Now, before we get into the notable and noble work of the society, let's just talk briefly about what the apostrophe is, why there's a war waging on about it.
That's right. So this mark first appeared in 1496 in the work De Aetna by Pietro Bembo. The apostrophe, strictly as a symbol, was the result of just one of many scholars at the time sort of experimenting with different kinds of punctuation.
Such as the engraver Geoffrey Torrey, who would then use it in the French language to indicate elision, which is the dropping of letters and syllables in written words. And this would then inspire the same practice in English.
And the name of the mark originates from the Greek apostrophe, meaning the act of turning away, which before the mark was invented denoted a rhetorical device. This was the time at which a speaker in a work turned away from the audience as a whole to address a single person or thing.
That single person or thing seemed to often be an absent person or thing, and thus the apostrophe began denoting absent letters.
And just quickly, because we got to get some etymology in here, the Greek apostrophe comes from apo, for off or away from, and strephein, for to turn. And yes, that is related to catastrophe, which has the Greek kata prefix for down, literally meaning downturn.
Okay, whew. Now, with that out of the way, we've got the lay of the land. Bob, why don't you give us an idea of the Apostrophe Protection Society? When was it founded? Why was it founded? Tell us everything.
Okay, I will certainly do that. The Apostrophe Protection Society was started in the UK in 2001 by a retired journalist called John Richards. And he had the specific aim, and I will quote, of preserving the correct use of this currently much abused punctuation mark. And he was looking at that in all forms of text written in the English language. In November 2019, John decided to close the APS, the Apostrophe Protection Society, citing his personal need at the age of 96, so clearly apostrophes are good for you, to cut back on his commitments, and also his view that fewer organisations and individuals were actually caring about the correct use of the apostrophe. He felt that the APS had done its best, but that the ignorance and laziness present in modern times had won. And he famously declared in one interview that the barbarians have won. I actually think the barbarians have simply worn him out. But his announcement in November 2019 brought an enormous amount of interest, both from the media and other people worldwide, most of whom were suitably shocked by his decision. John then unfortunately passed away in, I think it was early 2021. And that leads us to my involvement in the APS. I've personally always had an interest in the English language for decades now. I always used to reckon I could look at a page of text and spot the incorrect apostrophes within just a few seconds. And I've been aware of the APS for a good while. But when I retired in 2021, I decided I had a desire to revive the APS, not only having the long interest in apostrophes, but now also having the time to pick it up as well. So I tracked down John's son, which took some time, and eventually agreed with him that I would take over the dormant website and everything to do with the society, and would completely relaunch the APS. So after lots of negotiation on that, the APS was finally relaunched at the end of January 2022, so just over 2 years ago, and here we are today.
So the APS, you mentioned, it was founded in 2001, but this tradition seems to date back even further with the Association for the Annihilation of the Aberrant Apostrophe, founded in the 1980s by author and playwright Keith Waterhouse. Do you know if Richards was familiar with the existing fight for the apostrophe?
Given John's background as a journalist, I'm pretty certain he would have been familiar with the AAAA, though I'm not aware of any direct link. But when Keith Waterhouse died in 2009, I think the AAAA pretty much died with him.
Sure. I guess it's now sort of absorbed into you.
Well, I guess I've taken over that function. I'm not sure if Keith Waterhouse ever had a particularly active group, or whether it was really him and a couple of friends that just talked about it in his role as author and playwright.
And you certainly do take an active role in trying to educate the populace.
Indeed.
So one thing that we'd like to accomplish today is to give genuinely confused folks at home a chance to get a hang of this surprisingly loaded punctuation mark. There's a lot.
And maybe stop calling them barbarians.
We'll find a nicer name for them in public. In private, they'll still be barbarians.
And I think genuinely confused folks is maybe quite a nice name for them.
Yeah, it is. It's straightforward,
They're trying, Yes. We're all just trying out here.
So, Bob, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of apostrophe usage. We want to start off with possessive cases in apostrophes. First off, what is the possessive? Why am I seeing that it's actually the genitive case? What is the genitive case? Please tell me.
Right. Well, one of the key uses of the apostrophe, I would say is sort of, one of effectively the two uses of the apostrophe, is to show the relationship of a noun to other words in a sentence. And that relationship can be ownership, possession, or simply some other kind of association. And this is where you add the apostrophe S to change a noun from being just a simple person, place, or thing to a person, place, or thing that has a relationship to something else. So, the boy's ball, the car's wheels, the company's logo, things like that. Mm-hmm. Now, this genitive case thing, they're not exactly the same. They're closely related. The genitive case is a somewhat broader concept than just the possessive case. Many languages have a full formal genitive case, and Old English did as well, but the modern English language has rather dropped the genitive case in all but a few sort of unusual cases, and the modern English language has a possessive case rather than a full genitive case. It's a fairly fine distinction, and to be honest, it's not one that we need to worry about too much here. So treat your possessive case and genitive case as being broadly the same, even though they are strictly a bit different.
That makes things so much easier for us.
Yeah, I think if I'm right, I think the subtle difference is that like the genitive case allows for the fact that it might not be a direct possession. It might just be a relationship of a different kind.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing. So my last name is Moyers, and I am constantly running into problems of Moyers's apostrophe S.
Yep.
What do we do with names that end with S and other things that end with S? Is there like an official stance on how to approach this problem? Because it's directly relevant to me.
Yes, there is, but you will probably be slightly dissatisfied because there isn't a single answer. So, quick bit of background. Most nouns form their possessive simply by adding apostrophe S if they're singular, or just apostrophe after the existing S if they're plural.
Right.
So names of people follow pretty much the same rule. So Peter's dog would have Peter apostrophe S. Now, as you say, it gets more complicated when the name ends in S already.
Right, but it's singular.
So
we can't use the plural rule.
That's right. So you then get a choice. More usually than not, it follows the same rule. So if you're talking about James, James's pen would still have that apostrophe S. So it'd be James ending in an S and then apostrophe S. So following that normal rule. But it is also a correct alternative to form the possessive of such a name with just an apostrophe. So James's pen, James apostrophe, no other S. Both are correct, but different style guides prefer one or the other. We in the APS support both styles. They're both perfectly correct. The key bit of guidance on that is whichever of those styles you want to use, simply stay consistent. Don't sort of switch between the two options in a single piece of written text. Stick to one or the other.
That's fair. Consistency is key.
I wonder if you're writing it without the S, if it's just James apostrophe, would you speak it differently? Would you say James instead of James's?
I don't think you would, no, because that would just sound very odd if you said James pen.
Sure.
I got asked this question once with a particularly difficult example, which was somebody called Louis. So Louis, because the oddity there is that Louis is pronounced without the S at the end.
Sure.
You can say Louis's pen, but exactly what you do with apostrophes and S's in that is a bit more difficult because if you put apostrophe S, it would then be Louis's pen, and it's impossible to pronounce. So for Louis's pen, I would just do the Louis apostrophe and no additional S.
Oh, interesting. Oh, I like that.
That's fair.
Yeah, it's quirky. It's good. Bob, what is a double possessive? Because I came across this the other day and was like, wow, how are we supposed to understand this?
Yes, so the double possessive is a bit of a more complicated one, and the genitive bit flips back in here. The double possessive is a slightly unusual grammatical construction. So let's take an example. A friend of Bob's is a friend of mine. Now, is it a friend of Bob's or should it be a friend of Bob? And it's a strange combination. A friend of Bob's is the more correct version. And if you look at a friend of mine as well, that's slightly odd because mine is a possessive pronoun in its own right, because you would say a friend of mine rather than a friend of me.
Right.
So you've got this double possession. You've got the of, and you've got the, in the case of Bob's, the possessive S at the end of Bob, and in the case of mine, you've got that possessive pronoun. It may look and sound slightly odd, but it's a very well-established construction, and it fits into that genitive case concept that we briefly spoke about and said that we didn't need to worry about. But it is an unusual example of where the genitive case has remained in modern English. So saying a friend of Bob's is a friend of mine is spot on right. The same approach can sometimes clarify the precise meaning of a phrase. So just to sort of expand on that one slightly, if we take a photograph of Bob's, is that different from a photograph of Bob? Absolutely. A photograph of Bob's is a photograph
Belonging to.
that belongs to me, to Bob, whereas a photograph of Bob is a photograph where Bob is the subject rather than the owner.
Yeah.
This is a nightmare.
I wouldn't say it's a nightmare. It's to me, it's one of those lovely, subtle things that makes the English language so much fun.
It is. You know, it's just occurring to me, it's interesting that English maintains a double possessive as acceptable, but double negatives, which is a thing that's acceptable in a lot of other languages, and I think was in like earlier forms of English, that is like not acceptable in prescriptivist English now.
I think there are cases where it can be very precisely used to really add effect, but you're absolutely right. Most cases, double negatives is just very sloppy English.
A not friend of not Bob's is not a friend of mine.
And unfortunately, that's not the only sticky case we have with possessives, because there's also the it's with no apostrophe and your with no apostrophe, as opposed to it's with an apostrophe is not the possessive and your apostrophe re is not the possessive.
Yeah, so this isn't so much a tricky rule as simply two different words that unfortunately sound the same. It's is actually quite easy. It's with no apostrophe is simply a possessive pronoun like his or hers. It's his car, it's her house, and the dog lifted its foot. It's a possessive pronoun. That's the end of. There is no apostrophe. It's with an apostrophe is a contraction or a shortening of it is or it has. And the apostrophe is sitting there to indicate that a letter has been omitted. And if you're in doubt when writing, just remember that simple rule and try expanding out the it's that you've put with the full either it is or it has. And if it doesn't make sense, it's therefore wrong. And probably just to sort of finish that one off, I occasionally see it's with an apostrophe after the S, so ITS apostrophe. That one is simple.
Oh.
That one's simply always wrong.
That one's easy to remember. It's just wrong.
You talked about your versus your as well. The same argument applies there. Your, Y-O-U-R, is a possessive pronoun. It's your book, it's your house. No apostrophe. Your with the apostrophe, Y-O-U apostrophe R-E. Again, expand that out. It is short for you are. So if that expansion doesn't make sense, you've wrongly put the apostrophe in there.
Yeah, this is a perfect segue into talking about contractions and the apostrophe. So whereas understanding the use of an apostrophe is vital for possession, it seems like the understanding of language is more important when it comes to the apostrophe when used in contractions. Can you talk more about apostrophes and contractions, Bob? Elucidate us?
Yeah, so a contraction is where you've taken two words and sort of bumped them into each other in order to make it shorter. And you do that by taking out one or sometimes more than one letter. So if you've got can not or cannot, you can combine those two words together with can't. So C-A-N and then an apostrophe to indicate that some letters have been removed, and then the T. So you have can't, and as we've already discussed, you have it's and your, and lots of other words where that gets combined together to contract those two words together. And there you just have to remember that the apostrophe indicates typically one, but sometimes more than one letter that have been left out. So if you're taking can't, it's actually a different word from can't. C-A-N-T, is a valid word and means something else. So those apostrophes are important. Again, they're only visible in written English, but apostrophes to indicate contractions are important because they help clarity.
Right. It's like a real linguistic change
yes.
there.
Yeah.
So, Bob, let's talk about what the Apostrophe Protection Society at large is aimed at providing the world. Why should we bother protecting the apostrophe?
Well, the apostrophe is It's an unusual piece of punctuation, as it can almost function as both an alphabet letter in its own right, as well as being a piece of punctuation. It's maybe the only piece of punctuation that actually works in that way as well, because without the apostrophe, the word can feel incorrectly spelt. And that's particularly true in the case of concatenations. In general, punctuation is used to make the writer's meaning clear. So, for example, commas, semicolons, full stops, periods are there to indicate either a slight pause, a longer pause, or a proper full-length pause at the end of a series of words in a sentence. And these various pauses matter in spoken English as well as in written English. Apostrophes provide a similar and important function in written English, making that clear distinction between alternative meanings and helping to indicate possession in the case of those possessive apostrophes. And the Apostrophe Protection Society is there to help champion the case for the correct use of the apostrophe.
I guess I'm just imagining some sort of, moral failings of society through misuse of the apostrophe leading to misunderstanding of words. Is there like some sort of world where that may happen through the misuse of the apostrophe?
I don't think it sort of quite falls down to full sort of, moral breakdown of society. But I think in the same way, is spelling important? Some people would say, no, you can spell words however you like. People will probably work out what you're talking about. You could say the same about punctuation and the apostrophe. But if we're trying to make sure that we can get clarity of communication, and the world could do with an awful lot more of clarity in its communication with each other. You mentioned, early on that we're not talking about a war, but I'm sure there have been conflicts that would have been over an awful lot more quickly if communication was better. So that's what the apostrophe is trying to do. It's part of just trying to make communication easier and more concise.
So perhaps, is it fair to say that society, the APS, takes a prescriptivist approach, but for everyone's best interests at heart?
I think that's right. The APS is advising people and organisations of the correct ways to use apostrophes. So, follow the rules. It's either correct or it's not. But there has to be some flexibility in there to allow for changes in written English over time. For example, and it's a simple example, when the word telephone was first abbreviated to just phone, people would correctly put an apostrophe at the beginning of the word to indicate the missing letters. I'm sure you will have seen it, even though probably not for some decades. Certainly my parents would always have put apostrophe phone when they wrote phone. And it's there to indicate the missing letters. But it's changed in more recent use, certainly the last 40 or 50 years. And people now just correctly put phone without any apostrophe. So that's just one simple example of the way that things evolve over time in the language.
Sure. It's like how people have started writing email, just lowercase email. We don't do capital E hyphen anymore.
That's a great example. And that's an example over the past 10, 15 years as to how that's changed. I think brand names are another good example of how usage changes. When the bookstore chain Waterstones was first opened in 1982 by Mr. Tim Waterstone, it had an apostrophe in its name to indicate that it was indeed Tim Waterstone's bookstore. Now, when they rebranded, Waterstone had sold the business in 2012, they chose to change their branding to just Waterstones. It's a cleaner look, without the apostrophe. Now, at the time, John Richards, the original founder of the APS, thought this was a terrible idea, and he argued passionately for them to change it back. But these days, the APS and myself consider this to be totally okay. It's up to organisations to decide what they want to be called and how to write their names. Also worth noting that McDonald's has absolutely chosen to retain their apostrophe.
Yeah, that's sort of personal choice on the brand of how they want to be written out. Yeah. It's, I was thinking about the way you've described your predecessor's APS versus your APS. I feel like there was a culture in the 2000 aughts among nerdy intellectual people like ourselves of being sort of proudly pedantic about language and really getting satisfaction out of correcting everyone around us. And I think at this point, we've all sort of realized it's unnecessary to do that and just winds up pushing people away. Do you feel like that cultural shift is borne out in the old and new APS?
I think the new APS has got certainly more acceptance of variation when it's acceptable. Sorry, it's a bit of a self-defining statement, that.
Sure.
But for example, simple examples, you can't tell if apostrophes are being used in spoken English. That's a trivial example. But I think if you look at social media usage, I take a very relaxed view on social media and punctuation in general. Social media is an informal level of communication, and as such, it doesn't need to be grammatically correct. Similarly, if I'm talking to friends in a bar over a beer or two, my sentences probably aren't going to be grammatically perfectly correct. But it doesn't matter because it's relaxed, informal usage. But certainly in formal written English, it's important to adhere to those rules, and I would say I'm still very prescriptive about formal written English.
The relationship between, I guess, spoken English and written English, it's interesting because on the one hand, you feel like, well, these two things must have a lot in common. And then when it gets down to the nitty gritty, there are a lot of necessary differences just because of how the formats are.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? How do you feel about, I guess, using the apostrophe and other grammatical marks in order to intentionally reflect spoken English, such as like when you're writing an ing word, leaving the G off at the end and putting an apostrophe in?
Right. Yes. I mean, that's an interesting one. Yeah, there is quite a history to dropping the G on an ing word. Shakespeare used to do it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it can flow nicely. Shakespeare would sometimes use an apostrophe in the middle of a word to drop a syllable out the middle.
Gotta make that iambic pentameter work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes the best way of doing that is to artificially drop that syllable out by popping an apostrophe in there.
Should we be doing that more in written English?
I don't think so. I mean, it's certainly not something that I would recommend doing in anything approaching formal written English. But yeah, in informal English, hunting, shooting and fishing without any G's is probably fine.
Yeah, I know. I do that all the time when texting, and it's so funny to me because it doesn't save any keystrokes when you're texting. It just feels right to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine, but as I say, don't do it in formal writing.
Right.
Unless you're trying to get across something very specific.
Exactly. Yes. If you want to do that, there was one article written a few months ago in the Washington Post. One of the journalists at Washington Post interviewed me at some length and then wrote an article. And he managed to get an apostrophe into every sentence in the fairly long article that he wrote. And he managed to do that in at least one occasion by dropping the G off an ing word. So there are valid cases for doing it.
Sure. So I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier. I feel like this is related. Why can't we then drop the apostrophe in can't and just understand through context that we mean the cannot can't and just call it a new word?
Because certainly some of those words, you'll end up with a very different word. Can't and can't is an example. You could do it, but it's the other ones and these ones keep on coming up in predictive text when using a smartphone. Yeah, wheel rather than well. So W-E apostrophe L-L. Yeah, it so annoys me when predictive text will put that apostrophe in when I don't want it. Or, we're, W-E apostrophe R-E, compared to were, W-E-R-E. They're totally different words. And yes, you could argue, you could probably work out what was meant by the context, but it hardly helps the flow of the text that you're reading if you have to keep on stopping to think, what does the writer actually mean there? So no, I would certainly argue that the dropping of apostrophes in anything approaching even slightly formal text is not to be done.
It might make it slightly easier for the writer, but way more difficult for the reader.
I don't think it should make it easier for the writer either. I mean, I think any good writer should be able to get the apostrophes in the right places.
Sure. And the APS certainly makes attempts to bring these out into the world. You mentioned in a February newsletter that you emailed a business regarding their use of its no apostrophe instead of its with the apostrophe, and they corrected it. And it's sort of these like little acts of corrective guidance. Do you think they could get us to like a full apostrophe actualization?
Yeah.
I think it's a step along the way. It's a minor point, but they do all add up. And small wins like that, to be honest, they help to make it all feel worth the effort.
Similarly, something that recently put the APS at the forefront of the news cycle was the St. Mary's Terrace incident. Would you be so kind as to tell our audience about that?
Absolutely. It was a story about a road sign in a village in Hampshire, England, that lost its apostrophe. The local city council decided that apostrophes were no longer needed in road names. And when this particular road sign for St. Mary's Terrace, and that's Mary, Mary apostrophe S, because the terrace had a close association with St. Mary. When this sign was given a refresh in late 2022, the replacement sign was delivered without its apostrophe, so just St. Mary's Terrace, no apostrophe. And the local council came up with some totally wacky story saying they'd taken guidance and omitting the historic apostrophe would make life easier for delivery drivers in the emergency services.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, totally ridiculous. And the council had clearly not expected one local resident to object to this in such a determined way. So there was a gentleman called Oliver Gray, who was a retired teacher. He expressed his discontent to the council, and after much arguing and the support of his local councillor, the council finally reversed its decision. And they managed to find the original sign that had just been dumped, had it properly sandblasted clean, had it repainted, and it was restored to its rightful place. Now, as a story, that was a cute story. It could have been just covered by the local paper and then faded into obscurity. But more and more of the British national newspapers picked up the story, as did a number outside the UK, particularly in the Republic of Ireland. And it rapidly turned into one of those feel-good news stories that became a headline in its own right. And over the following days, lots of newspapers started picking it up. The Guardian newspaper in the UK contacted me for my thoughts on the story, and they wrote a long resulting article that had a load of quotes from me and some great publicity for the APS. I was also contacted by several radio stations in the UK Ireland. I even managed to make it onto the final story on the radio news as well. So, stories like that are great because they're small stories that can really bring a lot of sort of feel-good feeling about it.
It keeps the troops rallied.
Yes. And clearly it was a story that was of interest to lots of people in the media and presumably to lots of the people that then read about it.
Yeah, who would have known the virality potential of the apostrophe?
Of St. Mary's Terrace. Now, I feel like we just have to mention quickly, you mentioned that Irish people became interested in this story.
Yes.
And I feel like we need to make mention of keeptheapostrophe.com regarding the apostrophe in Irish names like O'Malley or O'Rourke. What are they referring to when they say keep the apostrophe?
Right. So clearly, as you know, there are many Irish names that start with O apostrophe, certainly in the English spelling of their names. Irish language spelling can be different, but we're looking at English usage. But there are quite a lot of websites or computer forms that simply won't allow non-alphabetic characters like an apostrophe to be entered into a surname field, to only allow the letters A through Z, which means that in cases with surnames like O'Malley or O'Rourke, surnames like those with an apostrophe need to be entered without the apostrophe, either by just omitting it altogether, so that Mr. O'Malley would simply become Mr. Malley, or substituting a space, which again, some systems simply won't allow you to have a space partway along your surname, or in extreme cases using the O as the middle initial. And all of those workarounds are simply incorrect. So what the Keep the Apostrophe in Irish Names group is trying to do, is to get the creators of those forms and websites to allow the apostrophe to be used, and then to allow these people to enter their names correctly. Yeah, it's part of their name. They should be able to use it.
Yeah, our systems should be designed around the apostrophe. It's been around long enough.
That's right. And imagine the case where you've ordered an airline ticket online, and as Mr. O'Malley, you've had to leave the apostrophe out. That's fine until you go along to the airport and you hand over your passport, which shows a different name.
Oh, yeah.
There have been cases where people have been refused boarding of an aircraft because the name on their ticket doesn't match the name on their ID. So it is important.
Yeah, very important. Speaking of this importance of the apostrophe, what are some of the goals that you have for the society in the coming months or years, Bob?
I guess really the goals are to try to get more involvement. The APS now has got almost 4,000 signed up members, which I'm very, very pleased with, because it helps to give more credibility in what we're trying to do. We get better media coverage. More and more people will take notice of us, and hopefully more and more organizations will sign up to the fact that they need to make sure that they are using apostrophes correctly. And finding other high-profile stories of apostrophe success definitely has to be a goal.
We should also mention on your site, you do list more uses of the apostrophe than the few we've spoken about so far. So just to make sure, we're trying to get the word out. We're trying to boost to 5,000 and beyond. Are there any other uses of the apostrophe that you're passionate about that we haven't touched on at all?
Yeah. Actually, I would say the most important one is the reverse. It's where apostrophes get used when they shouldn't be. And the biggest one of those is an almost 100% statement that says apostrophes are never used to make a plural. And it's a simple rule that gets misused so often. I would say it's probably the commonest mistake that I see. There isn't an apostrophe in bananas or menus or even in parsnips. The only valid exception is where it aids clarity. And that is almost a unique case is when you're making plurals of single lowercase letters. And the phrase dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
Sure.
I will put apostrophes in I's and T's because without it, it looks very odd indeed. And it's getting back to, I guess, that number one rule for all punctuation, was that it's there to aid clarity. But other than probably that one unique exception, do not put apostrophes in plurals.
Correct me if I'm wrong, is the incorrect use of an apostrophe like that, is that called a greengrocer's apostrophe?
It's a wonderful term, yes, the greengrocer's apostrophe. and it's because of the numerous cases where greengrocers, fruit and vegetable sellers, will put carrots, apples, bananas, and will put an apostrophe in every single case. I don't know if it's a term that gets used much outside the UK, but it's certainly in the UK, a greengrocer's apostrophe is a very well-known term.
I do have to say that I Googled this term just about 10 minutes before we started recording, and the example sentence that Google gives us is, "The Apostrophe Protection Society will have to work vigorously if it is going to have any effect on the greengrocer's apostrophe."
Oh, well, I'm delighted that it mentioned us.
There we go. Bob, thank you so much for talking to us about all of this today. It really gets my high school grammar nerd satisfaction. This has been a fantastic talk, and thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, so I think at this point, we're going to go to our game, but our producer has told us that it's a little different from what we typically do. So we're going to actually ask you before we begin, is there anything that you'd like to plug for the Apostrophe Protection Society?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. Just very briefly then, the website. I do encourage people to go and have a look at it. It's either apostrophe.org.uk, or if you want a longer URL, it's apostropheprotectionsociety.org. So I would encourage your podcast listeners to go and have a look at that. And that's also got links to our presence on Facebook and Twitter or X or whatever it's called at the moment. You can join the APS via the website. It's free. No charge, free membership. And if you do that, you'll get the periodic newsletters that I write. And the newsletters are a mix of stories relating to the apostrophe, my thoughts, and anything else that might be of interest that particular month. So I do encourage people to please join. There's also a store page on the website where you can find various apostrophe and other punctuation related merchandise. And finally, there are lots of examples of apostrophe errors that members have sent in, photographic examples of apostrophe errors, and some of those are immensely entertaining just in themselves.
Yeah, the website is a lot of fun, and the newsletter is great. You really do a good job of making everything digestible and fun. There's a lot of great info on there for anyone who's curious about anything apostrophe related. Bob, thanks so much again.
Thank you.
All right, let's play a game, shall we?
Hi, everybody. My name's Bethany Keeley-Yonker, and believe it or not, the apostrophe isn't the only superscript diacritical mark prone to misuse and abuse. And that's why, in 2005, I launched the blog of unnecessary quotation marks. On that blog, I curated images of oddly placed quotation marks on billboards, flyers, memos, and more. So today, I'm presenting to you the game of unnecessary quotation marks.
Fantastic.
Hi, Bethany. This is so exciting.
This is crazy.
I'm excited to be here. So here's how the game's going to work. I'm going to read you the text of some public display of information, and each of you will have to guess which of the words is unnecessarily quoted.
Okay.
Okay, so here's the first one. It has a great idea for your next date night. Here's what the sign says. Check out our selection of new Vermont cheeses to enjoy with your wine. Which of these words was unnecessarily quoted?
I mean, cheeses is definitely the most terrifying word to be in quotation marks there. So I'm going to stake my guess on that one.
I will go for our selection.
Oh, that's good too. I'm going to go with enjoy.
Well, that's an excellent start because you're all wrong. The word was new.
New.
Why?
All right, here comes your second chance. This is a sign at a cash register, and it says, any orders over $50 using a credit card needs a signature verification. And this time I can tell you that it's a pair of words in quotes.
I feel like credit card feels likely.
I would guess over $50.
I was thinking,
You know, that's great because I'm going to go with signature verification.
this is hilarious.
Well, great news. Bob is on the board. That was correct. The answer is over $50.
Wow.
Congrats, Bob.
All right. This next sign maybe needs to be put out after the rush over new Vermont cheeses. Here's what it says. We are currently out of cheese. We apologize for the inconvenience. We will be getting some later today. There are 3 words in quotes in this case.
3 all in a row.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's out of cheese.
I agree.
I want to be different, so I'm trying to figure out what's a good 3. I'm going to say it's be getting some.
That was a plausible guess, but Bob and Emily are correct.
Oh, man.
Sorry, Kyle. I'm in it to win it.
Okay, finally, the last sign is a warning. Please do not use the elevator for your safety maintenance. And there's a real twist on this one. All of the words are in quotation marks except for one.
They've unquoted one word?
I mean, maintenance would make the most sense if they had everything in quotes except for the sort of byline at the end.
I would go for the other end then, and I'll say please was the word that wasn't in quotes.
Well, I'm going to go smack dab in the middle and say it was elevator.
Emily got it this time. That was maintenance, not in quotation marks. So we have a tie.
Wow.
Emily and Bob each have 2 points. And actually, your producer has given me the right to give prizes to both of you. So, Bob, your prize will be a copy of my 14-year-old book, The Book of Unnecessary Quotation Marks, A Celebration of Creative Punctuation. Readers should be able to find this book online as well, wherever back collections of books are sold. But Kyle and Emily, you both get a prize, and that prize is you will be doing a full interview with me that will be available on your Patreon.
Hey!
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Oh, what an exciting day. Congratulations, Bob.
Well, thank you.
Thank you again to Bob McCalden and the Apostrophe Protection Society. Remember that you can find them at apostrophe.org.uk. And also thanks to the complete surprise of Bethany Keeley-Yonker from the blog of Unnecessary Quotation Marks at unnecessaryquotes.com. This was indeed a complete surprise. Thank you so much, Bethany.
Delighted to be here.
And you can actually hear our interview with Bethany now at patreon.com/butternoparsnips. Just $5 a month gains you access to that conversation, as well as the entire backlog of our Patreon exclusive podcast, Buttered Parsnips.
As always, listeners can find Butter No Parsnips on social media, on Facebook and Instagram at Butter No Parsnips Podcast, and on TikTok at Butter No Parsnips. And if you like today's episode, consider giving us a 5-star rating or review wherever you heard us.
And with that, I've been Kyle Imperatore.
And I've been Emily Moyers, and you've been...
Bob McCalden with the Apostrophe Protection Society.
Bethany Keeley-Yonker of unnecessaryquotes.com.
And this has been Butter No Parsnips.
Butter No Parsnips is produced by Emily Moyers, Kyle Imperatore, and myself, Seth Gliksman. The main and accompanying themes were composed by Kyle Imperatore. Thank you again to Bob McCalden from the Apostrophe Protection Society at apostrophe.org.uk and Bethany Keeley-Yonker from the blog of Unnecessary Quotation Marks at unnecessaryquotes.com.